Hi folks, welcome to lecture number 2. Today we're going to be talking about media convergence and participatory culture. I'm Dr. Matthew Hale. Good to see you again. Look at my big eyes in the photo. All right, so let's talk a little bit of business before we move on to the actual content. So I sent out a link, had a little survey. I wanted to ask your opinion on some potential course topics for a pop culture class that I'm going to be offering. It's brand new, special topics, and I haven't yet picked the topic. I wanted to gauge your interest. So I sent out the survey. 13 of you, I believe, have answered it thus far, at least at the time that I took the screen capture. So there is a tie for the first place, which was between a supernatural folklore focused class or a class about superheroes as modern mythology. There was also, incidentally, a tie at second place between a class focusing on memes and a class focusing on the body and communication. So if you haven't taken that survey, please do. It would be great if I could break these ties up. But nonetheless, this information is useful. None of you want to talk about fandom, or at least even that's quite close to the other results. So if you haven't chimed in, please do. I would love to hear your thoughts. Okay, so here's what we're going to do this week. So read these 3 texts. And if you haven't done so yet, if you haven't finished submitting your weekly reading notes, do that this week. So all of you, anyone in class, if you haven't gotten up to 8 submissions of weekly reading notes, now is the time to do so. We've only got so many more weeks in class left, right? So submit those by Sunday, April 5th by 11:59 p.m. A doc file, docx, PDF, any of those files are fine. Just submit them to that weekly reading notes Dropbox on D2L. If you are Patton, Virginia, or Abby, then you have an extra assignment. You guys are all doing discussion leader sections this week. So you'll need to create, provide a series of links, create a PowerPoint or a keynote, create art. You could produce some sort of visuals, a handout, upload that as if you were going to be leading discussion in an IRL context into that Dropbox. So all of that stuff, whether you're one of those 3 folks who are leading discussion or anyone else in class, all that's going to be due on Sunday. All right, so in order to talk about media convergence and participatory culture, we need to first kind of look at some history and look at the history of technology. Now, I need to state sort of a caveat, I guess. I am not a deep historian of the computer. That's not my area of expertise, but I've done my best to kind of give you a very brief history of the computer, mobile devices, and the internet, and then specifically social media there at the end. This is, as all histories are, incomplete, so bear with me. I'm going to try my best to get through this quickly and efficiently, but give you enough information that if you hear anything that sort of piques your interest, you've got the internet. Hopefully you've got the internet. You won't be watching this if you don't, but go explore. If you're interested, explore, do some digging, all right? So 1822, we have the difference engine, which is later renamed the Analytical Engine after some modifications and revisions. It is developed by English mathematician Charles Babbage. It is a giant steam-driven calculator. It's a mechanical calculator. It doesn't succeed. It fails. It's revised and renamed, and it fails to exist in the world as a physically functioning, operational, ginormous calculation machine. Ada Lovelace, on the right of Charles Babbage, was also an English mathematician. She was the daughter of Lord Byron. She is one of the very founding pioneers of computer programming. She developed one of the very first algorithms, and she was one of the first people to really think that these kinds of devices, the computer, could do more than just pure calculation. And this brings us to Alan Turing. So I'm going to read directly here from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. If you want to follow along, just search there, Turing machines. So Alan Turing develops what is called a Turing machine. So Turing machines, here's the quote, first described by Alan Turing in 1936 and 37, are simple abstract computational devices intended to help investigate the extent and limitations of what can be computed. Turing's, quote, automatic machines, as he terms them in 1936, were specifically devised for the computing of real numbers. They were first named Turing machines by Alonzo Church in a review of Turing's paper. Today, they are considered to be one of the foundational models of computability and theoretical computer science. So his work lays the groundwork for everything that the computer that we now know they're based on his ideas. He also helped to end World War II, saving an estimated 14 million lives. If you haven't seen the 2014 film Imitation Game, do check it out. It was on Netflix. I don't believe it currently is. You should watch this film and then do a deep dive on Alan Turing. Very interesting person. Jumping forward, J.V. Atanesov was a professor of physics and mathematics at Iowa State University. He attempts to build the world's first electronic computer rather than approaching it as a kind of mechanical problem with gears and belts and cogs. He thinks about it as an electronic device. So this is the formation of the first sort of electronic computer. By the mid-1940s, computers were huge. They filled entire rooms. And largely because of the technology of the time, right? They were powered by what are called, in the United States, they're called vacuum tubes. And in the UK, they're frequently called valves. If you're a guitar player or someone who uses a tube amplifier, you'll be very familiar with what's located on the screen there on the left. So in 1947, Shockley, Bardeen, and Brattain of Bell Laboratories invent the transistor. In that same year, Grace Hopper invents the first computer language, what would later be known as COBOL, or Common Business-Oriented Language. All right, jumping from 1947 to 1969, we have the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, or Arpanet. It was a computer network that gave rise to the internet, produced by an arm of the U.S. Defense Department. If you haven't seen the film Lo and Behold, Reveries of the Connected World by Werner Herzog, also, from 2016, it's really interesting, really good. Kind of puts a personal, interpersonal face on the development and early foundations of the internet. The concept of creating a connected network of computers was first produced by J.C.R. Licklider at MIT in the 1960s. He envisioned a kind of globally connected network, which we now know as and think of and use in our daily lives, the internet. The very first message that was sent by Arpanet was between UCLA and Stanford, and it was supposed to be the word login, Login, right? Only the L and the O successfully transmitted. But that was the very first message that was sent across Arpanet, which was the predecessor of the internet. In 1971, we get the first microprocessor. The Intel 404 microprocessor, for instance, has 2,300 transistors sort of squeezed onto it. In the 1970s, the first personal computers are developed and marketed for consumers. Prior to this, these were specialized niche devices, right? And all of a sudden, in the 1970s, working its way into the 1980s, the personal computer, it becomes just that. It becomes personal. It's a personal device. For example, it was a very expensive purchase. For example, in the Apple II in 1977 was about $1,298, and if we think about it in today's term, it's about $5,500. In 1972, Ray Tomlinson implements the first electronic, or what we call email, right, through Arpanet. Jumping forward again, in 1973, John F. Mitchell and Martin Copper of Motorola demo the very first handheld mobile phone. It weighs, as you can kind of tell in that photo, quite a lot. It's almost 4.5 pounds. 1989, Tim Berners-Lee develops the Hypertext Markup language, or HTML, which gives rise to the World Wide Web. In the 1990s, the first text messaging, we have the first bits of instant messaging. Mobile phones become more affordable, more accessible, and as a result, ubiquitous. They're not everywhere, but nearly, right? And as a result, they start to change the texture and rhythm of daily life in more and more profound ways. 1994, we have the first blog. The term weblog is later coined in 1997. Same year, in 1997, 6 Degrees, for what is many consider to be the first social media website, it comes into existence. From the 1990s up until about the mid-2010s, we see an evolution of the form factor and functionality of the phone, the mobile phone, right? They start to become quote-unquote smart. The first smartphone developed and was introduced into the market, I think it was introduced into the market in 94. It was developed from 92 up to 94. But 1994, we get the first smartphone onto the market. Things really take off, however, following the release of the iPhone around 2007. I believe it was 2007, and the iPad in 2010. So around 2010, onward, touchscreen technology, smartphones, these devices, these little rectangles that we carry in our pocket, start to do more and more things and become more quote-unquote smart. From 2000 onward, I would say really concentrated from like 2005 up into the 2010s. Social media websites, social media sites, and applications, or what we might call platforms today, sort of explode. They emerge onto the scene and just proliferate. This is sort of a major social media platforms list. There are lots of things that aren't included in this. Like, do you include Skype or LinkedIn, both of which were launched in 2003? What about Facebook Messenger, which came in 2011, same year as WeChat? What about things like Tinder or Grindr or OkCupid? Right? But here's just a major list of when people think of social media platforms, these are the ones I think come to mind. So in 2003, we have MySpace. It is followed by Facebook. 2005, we get YouTube and Reddit. Next year, there's Twitter. 2007, Tumblr. 2009, there's Imgur and WhatsApp. 2010, Instagram comes onto the scene. Then there's Pinterest. 2011, we get Snapchat and Twitch. And then in 2013, the very short-lived but quite culturally important Vine is launched. And the same year as TikTok. Now, TikTok had a predecessor called Musical.ly, which was launched in 2004. It was purchased, I believe, by a company in China and then rebranded as TikTok. And then Vine sadly died in 2016, and there's the little app icon for Musical.ly that preceded it. So yeah, long live Vine. I think its cultural impact has been absorbed into Instagram. Instagram, which is now owned by Facebook. A lot of people don't realize that Facebook owns Instagram. Instagram basically wanted to purchase Snapchat, which has this ephemeral, short-lived video, sort of, short bite-sized videos, and Vine. It wanted to buy Vine too, I believe. Neither of those two companies were sold to Instagram, and they effectively just poached ideas from these platforms, these sort of short bite-sized videos. Anyway, Vine was wonderful, and it produced a really interesting cultural impact. However, it did also give us Logan and Jake Paul, so, there's plus and minuses to everything, I suppose, right? So this is a very quick story, some highlights, if you will, of the creation of the internet as we now experience it and know it in our day-to-day lives. All right, so now we're where we can ask the question, what is convergence culture? Now, you read a bit of Henry Jenkins, or you will be, reading some Henry Jenkins for this week. So I'm not going to be regurgitating his argument that you're reading in the article entirely. I'm just going to be giving you some context, a little bit of background information, and maybe hopefully giving you some ideas that animate the readings for this week. So this is Henry Jenkins. He's a provost professor of communication, journalism, cinematic arts, and education at the University of Southern California. So what the selection that you're reading is from his 2006 book, Convergence Culture. In that, and in the selection that you're reading, he's making an argument about what he calls media convergence. He's saying that old media don't simply die out. Printing technology, for instance, doesn't die out because we have digital books, right? We have ebooks, but we still have books. They exist in a relationship that's constantly changing and evolving, but books don't cease to exist because we have digital versions of books. Music doesn't cease to exist because we've shifted from wax cylinders to, primarily streaming services for many people, right? It's that old media aren't being supplanted by newer, better, quote-unquote, superior forms of media. Rather, old and new media kind of collide and interact. He argues that convergence takes place, this media convergence takes place both from the top down, so if you want to imagine it, at corporate level decisions and media empires, as well as, or at the same time, it's happening from the bottom up in a young teenager's bedroom where you grab your cell phone and you and your friends go and hop on a skateboard and make skate videos and upload them to YouTube and develop a page for your brand and a business, right? Media becomes more participatory rather than how it had been in the quote-unquote old media world. So think about filmmaking, right? Like that example there. Instead of a studio owning all of the means of production, they create a film, they market the film, it gets released to the public consumes those texts. Now the public can hypothetically create their own texts. Many people don't, but the possibilities there are more than it had been previously. Now, one of the case studies, one of the things that Henry Jenkins focused on was that of fandom or fan culture. Right? He's one of the first people to ever really take that seriously. So he wrote several different books. I'm going to tell you about a couple of them. Textual Poachers, Convergence Culture. He wrote Fans, Bloggers, and Gamers, and then along with some other authors, including Sam Ford, Spreadable Media, which came out in 2013. Henry Jenkins was one of the first scholars to really take seriously the everyday lives and practices of fans, people who were really passionate about Star Wars or Star Trek or Beauty and the Beast or any sort of show, any sort of media property, any sort of pop culture thing. A huge part of their identity was built around these things that they consumed. And they didn't just consume this stuff, they also created things. He drew largely on the work of Michel de Certeau's The Practice of Everyday Life, which I believe came out in French in 1980 and was translated in 84 into English, if I'm not mistaken, off the top of my head. And he also worked and built upon a lot of the work from the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies and on the work of Janice Radway. So he would take things like fan art very, very seriously. The texts, fan fiction, things that fans created. They weren't just consuming this content, right? He's building on de Certeau's idea of textual poaching, right? So the idea that fans are taking things that exist within the public sphere, things that exist at hand, and recombining them and modifying them and reproducing and replicating them with difference and variation to create something new, right? You can see this in sort of the creative art scene, for example, here in the Star Wars realm, where people are combining characters in the upper left-hand corner, for instance, that exist in different properties, or creating fun, exciting things, or imagining characters in new ways. Baby Yoda, or the child, quote-unquote, Baby Yoda is what I'm going to call it. Baby Yoda comes out and everyone makes art. I have friends who make pens and sell things with Baby Yoda on it. There's all sorts of Baby Yoda art, right? Fans are producing all of this content in response to this media property, this media icon that comes out, and then they recombine and do creative things with it. Jenkins was saying this stuff is worthy of study. It's important, right? So that's one of the things I want when you're reading through Convergence culture to think about the ways in which people are participating rather than just purely consuming. And if you're interested in the art that's featured here on this slide, let's see, it's J. Shari Ewing, the child, the Baby Yoda eating things, is the person who created that. The C-3PO is by George Tarones, I think is how you say it. And then the Simba on Pride rock recreation from Lion King is from Roman Dubina. So if you're interested in their artwork, you ought to check them out. Interesting fan creators and artists. All right, so in relation to the creepypasta Slenderman text. So this is Trevor Blank. Trevor is an associate professor at SUNY Potsdam in the Department of English and Communication. He's written about a bunch of different things, urban legends and humor and internet folklore and creepypastas, from what you're reading this week, right? So here are a couple of his books, and here is a selection. The 2018 book, his most recent book to my knowledge, I could be wrong about that, I believe his most recent book is Slenderman is Coming, Creepypasta and Contemporary Legends on the Internet. That's the selection that you've written, you have to read. He also wrote this introduction, the book and the introduction, the collection is written with Lynn S. McNeil. She is a folklorist at Utah State University, and she focuses on legend and belief or supernatural folklore and digital culture. She's written about legend tripping with Elizabeth Tucker. I believe that's her most recent book. In this text, we're looking at Slenderman, and those authors are looking at Slenderman as this product of both communal and individual creation, a kind of crowdsourcing and rapid prototyping of ideas and stories. In a similar vein, it's a lot like Pierre Levy's concept of collective intelligence, which Jenkins cites and discusses in Convergence culture. The idea that you're being able to create this content through repetition and variation. It's a little different. The case of Slenderman's a little different from traditional urban legends that are often told as true. They're apocryphal stories that are told as true, and they seem and feel plausible, and that's oftentimes why they're compelling and why we spread them and share them with one another. Slenderman's slightly different, right? It's knowingly or intentionally a fabricated story, but it has a lot of the texture and feeling of a traditional urban legend. So whenever you're reading through that text, think through these ideas. what kind of changes it, or what differentiates it from a traditional urban legend. All right, and then the last text that you have for this week is by Dana Boyd. She is a principal researcher at Microsoft and the author of multiple books. Just brought up two here. It's Complicated from 2014 and Participatory Culture in a Networked Era. She wrote that along with other authors. I believe it's an edited collection. It's been a while since I reread that. It came out in 2015. And then Nicole B. Ellison. She is the Karen Wake Collegiate Professor of Information at the University of Michigan. And in 2004, she wrote the book Telework and Social Change, which is probably a really relevant text right now, since I and probably you are hopefully you're able to do your job. You're in a position that's privileged enough to be able to do your job remotely, like I'm, in the position to do this currently. The piece that you're reading by them, they're co-authors on this piece. It's from a 2013 collection, I believe, but this is an earlier edition of the text. It's kind of a rough draft of it. So if you see any typos or anything like that, be understanding the authors are, that text that you've got, I had a PDF of it just on hand. It's a work in progress there. So the piece that you're reading for this week, it's arguing for the importance of understanding platform architecture and the histories of social media sites or networks, or what we might call platforms today. They change and evolve, and it's really important to key into those changes and those developments, to think about it as a cultural product that's changing and shifting. And while we're also thinking about those architectures or those structures, we need to think about those social practices that human beings develop. So thinking about how that architecture shapes social practices, and social practices shape these personal technology architectures. All right, so that's scholarship for this week. Try to get through it the best I could. Hopefully the visuals are a little bit more interesting. You're probably potentially bored, so I wanted to recommend a couple of things you could watch. This is all based on having Netflix access. So if you don't have access to Netflix next week, I might suggest things from other sort of streaming services or video games that you might try while you're quarantined. So things that are relevant to class, the movies that made us and the toys that made us. I don't know how many seasons there are of both of these two different programs, but they're quite enjoyable. They're really easy. I think there's a kind of nostalgia that's at least maybe evoked for me that maybe won't be evoked for you because of the different demographics and age that they're targeting, but maybe it will. It's a good show. It's really fun. It's nice, light fare to put on in the background and not be bogged down. If you want to be slightly more techno-dystopian, check out Black Mirror. If you haven't, it aligns with many of the themes throughout our course, particularly at the first early part of the semester where we're talking about sort of the Frankfurt School. A film that we were going to watch, but since we're not going to be meeting together, we don't have the opportunity to, is American Meme. It's really, really good, talking about fame and sort of Insta fame or digital fame. Give that a look. And then also Love, Death, and Robots. Really, really good. You got to check that out. I don't want to say anything else about it. Also, two things that are directly related to what's in this slideshow. You might check out Jobs from 2013, which stars Ashton Kutcher. Then there was another biopic about Steve Jobs called Steve Jobs in 2015, starring Michael Fassbender. I actually just watched it for the first time last night. It's on either Netflix or Amazon Prime, one of those two. And then you might also check out the 2010 film. It was written by Aaron Sorkin and then directed by David Fincher, The Social Network. It's about Facebook. It's definitely worth your time. So that's it for this week's lecture. Hopefully you like the slides. Stay safe and take care.